discussion on the topic of current education disparities. To read the description of the event, in America, while there are schools virtually everywhere, not all of them are the same. Many minority students in America, as a result of institutional oppression, redlining, housing discrimination, and budget disparities, have been subjected to a lower quality of formal education experience that in many cases has directed the course of their lives. This panel discussion will have 5 to 6 guided questions that will be asked by me to the panelists, and they will respond from their own experience and expertise conducting research on critical education issues. The Racial Equity and Black Lives Matter Committee that formed this workshop thanks these participants again for their participation in this panel. I will allow our panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Dr. G.
Good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate everyone showing up today. My name is Kevin G, Associate Professor in the School of Education at University of California at Davis in California. My research focuses broadly on how school systems can better support students who encounter both adversity as well as are highly marginalized. So I look at issues around school bullying. In fact, there's a piece today that came out focusing on anti-Asian hate and bullying in schools. And so that's kind of the work that I do. I like to think of schools as in terms of what are schools doing structurally to sometimes further marginalize kids, especially Black and brown kids. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. G. Dr. Mallory.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's definitely a pleasure to be on this panel as well, just to discuss the topics of, educational disparities and the inequities that continue to be pervasive within the school systems across the country. So just a little bit about myself, Michael Mallory. A lot of my research is centered around culturally responsive pedagogy and how do we infuse not only that within the K through 12 and educational space, but also how do we empower the educators to be able to not only embrace these different methodologies, but also to understand the significance and the impact that it can have on, retention rates, self-efficacy, and so forth on these students. So something that I'm really passionate about, something that continues to be needed within the educational space, because the fact of the matter is, especially when it comes to students of color, indigenous populations who are not seeing themselves reflected inside of the school system, the academic and educational, outcomes are incredibly, atrocious at the moment. So it's something that needs to happen, and it's something that I'm passionate about and looking forward to building from there.
Thank you. We had Dr. Milner, but he may be having some connectivity issues. So if he returns, I'll have him introduce himself as well. But for right now, I'll keep moving forward with the introduction to this workshop. So I wanted to begin by contextualizing the motivation behind even having this workshop during the UConn Human Rights Symposium. So I will be reading an extended quote from the United Nations Children's Fund, which is commonly known as UNICEF. They had a blog post regarding the impact of COVID-19 on education globally. Begin quote, "More than 1 billion children are at risk of falling behind due to school closures aimed at containing the spread of COVID-19. To keep the world's children learning, countries have been implementing remote education programs, yet many of the world's children, particularly those in poorer households, do not have internet access, personal computers, TVs, or even radio at home, amplifying the effects of existing learning inequalities. Students lacking access to the technologies needed for home-based learning have limited means to continue their education. As a result, many face the risk of never returning to school, undoing years of progress made in education around the world." End quote. So while our workshop will be focused on how education disparities manifest, and in the United States specifically, it is important for all of us to remember the global scale and implication of this discussion as well. I see Dr. Milner. Dr. Milner said, he's having connectivity issues. Okay, so while he's figuring out about connecting to audio, I will go ahead and ask the first question to Dr. G. What is an example or examples of educational disparities, and how do they affect students of color?
Yeah, so before I get into this, kind of the big disparity that I tend to see, I just want to underscore something that you mentioned, Michael, which is education is a basic human right. And sometimes we forget that because of the way our education system has been, in many ways privatized, marketized. So if we kind of pull back on the global scale, I mean, I think we all need to kind of ground ourselves in this idea that education is a fundamental human right, as equal as breathing air, that everyone needs, right? We know getting more education leads to these positive outcomes, economic outcomes, social outcomes. But as you know, we're challenged because we're not providing high quality education in equal ways, which gets at this disparity question, which you just asked. So one of the disparities that I'll just mention that people probably tend to think first of are kind of the investments, or perhaps lack of investment or disinvestment that's happening in our education system. So I just pulled some stats up today, found out that nationwide in the US, majority non-white districts get 23 billion with a B less in funding every year than majority white districts. That, I think, starkly shows how strategic, historical in predominantly kids of color. We can talk about later about kind of strategies in overcoming that, but that basic disparity in funding itself, we have to think critically about how that disparity in funding translates into gaps in opportunities, gaps in the types of critical inputs that go into our education system. So again, the disparity in funding, that's kind of one main disparity that I kind of focus on. There are other disparities that I'm sure Dr. Mallory can speak to, but that's one that sticks out to me.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Mallory, do you have anything to add to what Dr. G?
Oh, absolutely. So, in addition to the lack of funding, right, and I didn't know that number, so 23 billion, which is a complete and utter reality for districts across the country. But in addition to that, right, lack to access to, right, oftentimes qualified teachers, right? There's so much research out there and data that suggests that urban schools, inner city schools, there are, a lot of teachers can go straight from have less than 1 year. Sometimes are educators that have not actually completed a full program that are educating these students to where more affluent suburbs and districts, right, require 5-7 years, for their educators to be in front of the classroom. So that's another thing. Self-representation from an identity perspective, right? Nationwide, I think the polling now from NCS study, just kind of shows, but I think right now still at one point it was a little roughly over 90% of the educators with middle class, white educators in the classroom. Now that's around 79 to roughly 82%, but still, right, largely a large population of the educators in front of the classroom oftentimes do not mirror or reflect the students that they serve, right? That's another aspect of, right, educational disparities. Lack of learning materials, so that goes in tandem with the funding aspect, but oftentimes it's been shown from data. You have inner city schools, urban schools, they're working with textbooks and other materials, sometimes 3-5 years behind their counterparts. So these things are constantly happening on a grand scale, and these things need to be addressed in order for, right, these students and these populations to have a fighting chance. And that's ultimately what these students, are looking for, are asking for. Can I just have a fighting chance, within the classroom, to move forward?
Yeah, agree 100%. I would add on top of that, to give kids a fighting chance, it's going to take our systems to understand how they have played a role in these disparities. Again, another example that comes to mind in terms of disparities is one in discipline, right? Suspension rates. We see time and time again kids of color, Black students being disciplined at disproportionate rates, and what feeds into that. And I think we need to be thinking about not just individual behaviors. I think oftentimes those of us in education work with educators who immediately go to the individual behavior of the kids and it's saying, well, time out. This is not always about the individual kid. This is about what's happening in the system. So what is the system doing? The way it's setting up its policies, practices, procedures to treat kids of color differently. And that's a more difficult conversation. You're asking systems to reflect on what they're doing. But I don't think it's a conversation we have enough, at least with kind of parents and teachers about what they're doing. And it's hard to be self-critical sometimes. So I get it. But yeah, I think what's happening in terms of, we need to kind of frame the disparities conversation less so around what are individual kids doing, but more of how can the system be contributing to those disparities?
Thank you both for those responses. So now I want to take it to a focus on the classroom. Dr. Mallory, so from your perspective, how does pedagogy or the form of teaching influence students' ability to see themselves in the material or to engage thoughtfully with it?
Right. So, a lot of my work and the research that I do, right, is centered around, culturally responsive, critical pedagogy. So pedagogy is everything. When we're talking about trying to increase, right, educational outcomes, being able to see yourself, your identity, your culture, and being able to engage in material that's reflected on that, that's everything. Right. I think we all can have different unique experiences, but with me now, have navigated and traveled the world and done so many things from kindergarten to 12th grade. It's funny as I reflect on my time, even in Louisiana. It was at a moment I did have some African American teachers in front of the classroom, but the pedagogy, I never saw myself centered within the pedagogy ever. And it's funny, as I got went through the research and understand the historical frames, and I started reflecting not just on myself, that I was able to kind of grip myself and had a great family dynamic to kind of navigate those spaces. But so many of my peers who were disengaged, right? The attrition rates, the individuals that, dropped out at 14, 15. And as I started reflecting, it's because they did not see themselves reflected in any of the pedagogy. And oftentimes that's the thing. I think I mentioned this on another panel another day, but I was asking some educators here in Connecticut. I said, do you all believe, right, from a pedagogy and the practices that it stands, do you believe that students of color, marginalized communities, so forth and so on, is it a privilege or is it a right for them to see themselves in the curriculum? And so many of these educators, rightfully, not rightfully so, but I guess in their own authentic and just honest way was, well, we believe it's a privilege. I was like, so you believe that by censoring their experience, their cultures, their histories within their learning experience, which all of the research suggests when educators see themselves, students see themselves within the curriculum, they're more engaged, they're more active, they want to show up, they want to participate, they want to bring their community and their native languages and cultures into the classroom. You mean all of that is a privilege, right? When the majority white more fluent in other cultures, that's been just the curriculum forever, right? So you're saying to do this is it's a privilege, but it's not an educational right. But then you want to have conversations here. Well, how do we increase their self-efficacy? How do we increase their graduation rates? But you don't want to center them, so pedagogy is everything. I'll let Dr. G chime in here, but and I think that's something, the research supports it, the data supports it, right? There's the frameworks there. Now institutions and school districts really need to say, are we going to commit to this, by and large, or are we just going to continue to have superficial conversations about what could be for this population?
Mm. Thank you.
Yeah. Dr. Mallory, you said a word that has me thinking a lot, this kind of superficialness, right? So you talked about this idea of, kids need to be represented in the curriculum and what they read and who they see, from who's in that classroom teaching them, right? To who shows up in the text and whose names and who's represented. And I would add that oftentimes kids of color who are represented in the classroom are represented in deficit ways. You see like images of kids in not a positive light, even in history texts, right? Or again, you see examples of very kind of superficial, surface level ways of representing one's culture, one's race, ethnicity, one's identity, without kind of the more kind of deeper work that needs to be done. And transitioning from the kind of this culturally relevancy to cultural sustaining, right? As you're an expert in that, Dr. Mallory, more than I. But this shift in the mindset from just not just not represent kids, but how do you make this kind of a sustaining practice with teachers, so it's kind of deeply embedded. So yeah, there's a lot of work for our systems to kind of be thinking about how kids are represented in the curricula, and that really does start with teachers. It starts from even I would say in higher ed. I'm very conscious and aware of when I select text or when I select readings, am I selecting works of individuals that represent kind of a diverse, racial, ethnic, gender, especially. I think, us in academia, we tend to go to kind of these older white males who do this work. And it's like, well, there are also up and coming scholars of color who also do this work as well. And so moving away from kind of sometimes these older paradigms that are kind of steeped in tradition and kind of moving more towards understanding how we as faculty, how we as educators can make conscious decisions, right? To ensure that what we engage students with exposes kind of the reality and the diversity of thoughts and ideas that are out there.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
thank you.
And not to throw it on you, Michael, but I'm just curious, right? When you navigated through your space, where you're from, and we're just unique. All three of us, right, come from unique parts of the world. Did you ever see yourself, right, reflected in the curriculum? And if so, what do you think made that happen? Even if not, how do you feel as you navigating through your graduate program? What could that have potentially meant for you as you're now seeing some of the things that Dr. G and I have experienced?
Great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. I would say personally, I don't think I've ever saw myself. Well, I've been to public school my whole life, entire life, K through 12, undergrad, graduate school. Even my next step, I'm still be at public school still. But I don't think I've ever saw myself per se in my particular experience. So whether that comes from my experience as a young Black male, whether that comes from my experience as a son of an immigrant family, excuse me, or whether that's just, whether it pertains to my specific cultural aspirations or, what matters to me, social emotionally to me as that K through 12 child. No, I don't think I ever saw it. Education. That's actually what drove me to work in education right now and kind of understand like why these discrepancies existed for when I was in the classroom in a predominantly African-American area. But I just, we always, from my subjective personal experience back then, we always felt that kind of distance from what we were learning or even being in school in general, because it didn't feel like that environment where we belonged in as young Black boys and girls when I was in Philadelphia and my youth too. So at the same time, so as I've gotten older, my personal research line, which is in income segregation and how it associates with district achievement, other income or achievement parameters on that scale. I've tended to focus that cultural responsiveness and understanding and context in terms of policy and equity. What's happening here and how can we really look at, what these trends are looking like, whether it's achievement, whether it's diversity, whether all these issues come about. What is the reality behind it? And I think that a lot of us in education, as we should be now, is solution focused as well. But sometimes I don't think we study enough about how we got here. And that's something I kind of tend to focus on. And what is the true political, social, economic reality that got education to be where in 2001 through 5, when I was a child, I experienced this in like the No Child Left Behind era and moving up forward from there as well. So I think it's about, even though I find that was a deficiency for me when I was younger, I've kind of brought that to like a focus in my career where I kind of want to spread the message with other professionals such as you two and beyond in my academic community, where we can have these more in-depth conversations so we can focus on, ways that we don't have to keep having these conversations in the future too as well. But thank you for that question too, because it actually does lead into my next question, which is a more general question to you both. And so we talked about teachers and their development pedagogy and then cultural responsiveness and all these great perspectives from both of your research lines. So I wanted to ask specifically, what do you think for schools or districts and even universities, how can they improve the development, recruitment, and retention of Black, Indigenous, people of color teachers so that that culturally responsive can come in and so that they can actually, have more space in the classroom to develop curriculums and so on and so forth.
Yeah, Dr. G, you have it. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I was gonna first have you chime in, Dr. Mallory. That as you asked that question, I'm sitting right now on a recruitment committee, in fact, for our school around thinking about how we best diversify the teaching profession. And I'll be honest, in those conversations, I think sometimes like the seeds of who wants to become a teacher get planted early on. I think they get planted early on in individuals' own experiences with education. And we know time and time again, I think, a lot of the research says that a lot of teachers of color want to become teachers because of negative experiences that they've had in the classroom. And that I get it, but it's also disheartening because I want teachers of color to go in because they had a teacher of color that they really looked up to, rather than saying, I want to kind of fix all the negativity. Because that, like, how sustainable is that, right? If we keep getting teachers decade after decade saying, I became a teacher because I had these horrible experiences 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, because that means that systemic change hasn't happened. Right, all the kind of negative experiences that these students of color are having haven't gone away, So in terms of, I think, the development and development side, I think this starts early on. So if we can kind of, I think change, again, this is a tall order. I mean, we're asking to change the entire system, but I think in some cases we're at this moment, right? We're in the middle of the pandemic still, but there is like a huge focus now on our education system. So what can we do now to ensure that 20 years down the line, a kid who's entering kindergarten now doesn't say, "Oh, I had this horrible experience as a kindergartner or first grader. That's why I want to become a teacher." Because I feel like if we continue to do business as usual, that's where we're going to head. So if we can really take time now to think about how our teachers are trained, but also what happens in our schools now to ensure that we're really putting a laser focus on these issues of equity. And Michael, you mentioned something just quickly, this notion of diversity, right? We can have diversity, but we can also lack equity, right? Those two things, don't go hand in hand. You have to be intentional about both. And you can't do lip service just to say, here, we hired X number of faculty of color or X number of teachers, or we've recruited X number of teachers into our program and we're done. That's again going back to Dr. Mallory's. That's the superficial piece of it, and it takes deeper work to be able to actually achieve sort of this equity and the inclusion part as well. So yeah, Dr. Mallory.
No, I agree with everything you said, and I think that intentionality, that's the only part. I think that from the university side, then there has to be intentionality. I know just from university and students that I've mentored over the years who've wanted to gain access into teacher programs, and it kind of the institutional setup or the makeup of even certain programs kind of dissuaded them, right? Kind of discovered, well, you know what, I can clearly see that I don't belong in this program, so then I'll go major in something else. So I definitely believe in the earlier aspect, because I think that's one of the things that pushed me away. It's funny how things from a purpose perspective come back in 360. But for me, my experience was negative throughout K through 12. I had a mother who was at K through 12 over 20, 25 years. But me seeing her experiences in tandem with my experience, I said, oh, of course. I ended up majoring in business in college, and then, life happens and it still brought me back to, where I believe I'm ultimately supposed to be. So definitely we need to, through the culturally sustaining pedagogy and those intentional aspects, need to, by and large, be there. So the new generation and the next generation won't just say, hey, I want to be a teacher because I had a sucky experience. It's like, oh my gosh, such and such, teacher, or my school was so amazing. It made me want to be a teacher. That's all I could think about. So that's definitely one part. But yeah, the other aspect, I think, just the accessibility and the intentionality of universities and teacher ed programs, shining the light at their university, shining the light in their communities and saying, we're going to be very diligent and intentional and saying, we're going to these different communities, right? Versus sometimes just doing research or the lack thereof research, but actually saying, we're going to create pipelines from 10th to 12th grade. We're going to create these immersion experiences for, BIPOC, students. And we're going to begin grooming them and exposing them and showing them the 1 to 5 to 10 year tracks, even into the administration aspects, if they want to. But that intentionality has to, and sometimes I just don't see from the university side that kind of excitement around, right? They'll use the diversity, they'll try to throw the terms, but okay, where's the intentionality? Where's your your department kind of a plan of action to make this happen? And until those things can happen in tandem, right? I always say there's always going to be the random 1 or 2 BIPOC students that come from amazing university programs, and then they'll be highlighted for 5 to 10 years, and then 2 or 3 more BIPOC if we don't disrupt this kind of continuum at the moment.
Yes, thank you so much. There were great perspectives on that issue. It's just very complex, it's hard to really pinpoint one thing, that's one practice or one resource for K through 12 or at the university level, preparing the future generation of teachers. But we as the purpose of this conversation, and as we are in the post COVID-19, I guess now, era of education, it'll become a focus in how, like you said, Dr. G, how you match that with purposeful implementation of systems of equity too at the same time. And so So to round up some of our last two questions. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, as I mentioned earlier, a concerning number of students failed to adequately access remote learning or have become absent completely. So Dr. G, I want to start you off really quickly, but what practices or resources will be best for engaging with this troubling rise in student absenteeism?
Yeah, that's an area that I kind of work on this,
Mhm.
when students are absent, especially chronic absence. So this is when kids are missing, upwards of 18 or more days, which is a pretty sizable chunk of the school year. And absenteeism rates have gone up, especially for really vulnerable youth populations. Some data I was looking at the other day, focused here in California, early returns last year in about March, April. We're showing that groups like foster youth, homeless youth, were missing on average around 40% of their kind of schooling. They weren't logging into their online platform or whatnot. You also have to understand that homeless youth, foster youth also intersect with other important identities by race as well. There's kind of a swath of kids who just have been disengaged with this system. I think re-engaging those students is going to take it's going to be a heavy lift. I think it starts in some cases with rebuilding, or just building in general trust with our education system, because that trust was lost. Because I think what happened is there was such a massive pivot to online learning, and then it was like this scramble to get everyone technology. I think what fell by the wayside was, understanding that not all kids were well equipped, nor families, by no fault of their own, because of broader systemic problems, challenges that this pandemic really, underscored, right? Systemic issues with food insecurity, housing insecurity, being able to, maintain a job, or parents who are holding multiple jobs. Again, some of these broader issues are kind of beyond the bounds of the school, but all of that filters in back into the school system. So if there's inequities existing broadly in our society, those are going to be reflected in our school system. So I think trying, granted, schools have done a lot. School districts and schools leaders have really stepped up in many cases to really meet the challenges of students and the needs, given also that schools and teachers are also themselves being impacted by this pandemic. So it's a challenge, right? Because we want our school systems to also kind of step up and do more, but also I hear teachers saying, well, wait a minute, we're doing enough, or we've done enough. I think this is where the role of kind of additional supports and resources can come into play to help teachers, to help principals kind of, again, reestablish connections with students. And I think that starts now. If we look ahead to the fall, I know in Connecticut, students there's been a mix of students who've been back in person, and perhaps in hybrid. California, we're just doing that now. And we're just kind of feeling our way through what this in-person schooling looks like. And I think this kind of grand experiment of how to re-engage students really needs to involve teachers doing strategic outreach, especially to the students who have been disengaged. And there's been instances of teachers doing home visitation to students and families to say, hey, we care about you. You're on our radar screen, and what are ways that we can have you come back into education, be it in person or a hybrid way of educating kids. So I think, it's the engagement piece is going to be critical, and especially the ones who have lost the trust in the system, rebuilding that trust.
Dr. Mallory, you have something?
No, I agree with everything with everything Dr. G mentioned. I would just say, in addition to kind of restoring that trust within the system, I think, especially for vulnerable populations, by and large, and how do we then not only try to help the restore that trust, but then play catch up for the year and a half that's been lost. You know what I mean? I think that's the other dynamic, to where, will institutions kind of put in some type of a system or programs, right? That then, once the in-person begins to kind of trickle itself back in, and we hopefully move to some sense of normalcy, whatever that will ultimately look like, right? But I think then what's going to be the learning curve to then help those students kind of reintegrate themselves into their learning experience based off of still the timing that was lost, right? Because let's be honest, right? Students of color, vulnerable populations who were in 8th grade, now transitioning to 9th, 10th grade, the reality is, you know, the educational experience was not the same, you know. So I do agree with Dr. G as well that so many school leaders and districts, they did the best that they could, right? And right, there still were certain blind spots that even them, right, they missed. But something is going to have to be intentionally done for this population, or right, and we can talk about, you know, that's a whole nother conversation of how different individuals kind of get passed through the K through 12 system, you know, through their efficacy rates and that. But I think that intentionality is the other that's going to be critical to restoring trust. Is okay, what are you going to do to now help catch my student up to speed, you know, based on, you know, kind of the things that have happened. So we'll see what happens. I'm not sure what's happening in California, if any plans in addition to the funding sources that's coming through the Biden administration, if those things are moving into motion. I know Connecticut is trying to figure that piece out, and I'm trying to be a strong advocate to say, hey, let's, while the transition happens back, let's not forget that we need to put some plans and institute some things for these students to then gain some of those skills that they've lost out just being at home all day, you know, and oftentimes alone because parents have to work, you know, 1-2 jobs for that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So totally agree. And I'll just add that, yeah, you know, in discussing this kind of intentionality, it has to also, you know, center equity at the core of this. And this, I think it's this, on top of the intentionality, it's also the sustainability of this, because we don't know what the longer term effects of this. So it can't be a one and done. Oh, let's do one summer of intensive supports. Let's do one kind of absenteeism intervention. But I think it's going to be a whole kind of suite of interventions, or kind of a holistic, almost kind of, you know, a wraparound model. And I know those kind of models are resource intensive and expensive, but, you know, here in the state of California, we've been given this massive infusion of capital into the system. So there is kind of a sort of a huge amount of resources to be able to kind of, I think outside of the box in many ways to continue to support kids and kids of color.
And so, for as we've been discussing this whole workshop about those potential solutions in the future, so I feel as though there's a theme coming about that, you know, looks like there needs to be large scale systematic change to some degree to address like at least one or maybe more of these problems coming forward from the COVID-19 and also before it too at the same time. Am I correct?
Oh yeah. That's right.
Because I was thinking, because one question I had, because I was researching into this same issue about, you know, how can not we, I'm not an education leader right now, but how can you know, that actually policy legislators, school administrators, district administrators, how can they you know, what program can they implement to help close that learning loss that we've seen from the past year too as well. And you mentioned, Dr. G, that, you know, maybe a one and done is not the choice. You may have to do several summers where we're continuously educating on this year-round basis, hypothetically, to help make not only close the gap, but also maintain that students are learning if it's an effective way of schooling students throughout the summers too as well. So with the trend so far that we're seeing from policies from the federal and state level, do you both, of course, you know, suggesting, or, you know, do you suggest that the current way that their lawmakers are currently going about crafting these policies, do you see, Dr. Mallory, you're in Connecticut, Dr. G, you're in California, do you see these lawmakers going into that direction of equity, going towards these solutions that we talked about during the session?
Well, one thing I'll say, Michael, is I think you are part of the solution. so don't underestimate your role in this, because you represent the next, you and Mason, I know Mason's on the call as well for this talk, and the audience that's watching today, right, at UConn or, you know, wherever campus they're in, you're part of the next generation. And that's why it's always exciting doing these kind of talks, because to be able to get to have you think about what your role is in this and the power that you do play, right, in kind of shaping our next generation as well. So that's kind of one piece I wanted to share with you. I think in terms of, you know, where kind of legislators sit or policymakers sit, I think, you know, the approach, at least in California, is to really recognize that these kind of decisions around how to best serve students need to sit at the local level, right? So there's a lot of local level decision making that I think our policymakers are well aware of. And that's a tradition in California, from even kind of the where to allocate money to best support kind of socio-economically disadvantaged youth, or foster youth, or homeless youth, or English language learners as well. So having said that, I think some of these kind of solutions are going to have to start with the community, and that in itself I think is challenging, right? Because we have to think about ways to be inclusive about including the voices of all our community members in the planning and the reopening of schools, especially for fall. And then I think it takes skillful leadership, especially in California, for our superintendents, our district leaders, who have to kind of convene these multiple stakeholder groups. And there's been a lot of tension, I must say. So, kind of comes back to this point I made around building trust, or rebuilding trust, or establishing trust, and incorporating the voices of communities that have typically not been engaged in kind of educational decision making. I think those are all important facets of this kind of strategy to move forward. It is great, you want to engage, but who do you engage, and how do you engage, and how do you make sure that engagement process itself is equitable?
Mm-hmm. Mm. Okay. Thank you. No, thank you, Dr. G.
Sure.
And for a lot of people watching, I'm like always like a reflective thinker in the moment. So I'm just like thinking about everything you shared as well. And so yeah, no, I never mean to undersell myself. I just always like be aware of like, oh, I'm not there right now, but I agree with you. Just because I'm not there right now doesn't mean people can't. I can't still have influence on what's coming up next.
Oh, yeah, we were all there. We were all up and coming at one point in our career.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I thank you for that reminder too as well. And so right now we have around 20 minutes left. So I do, before I ask our last guided question, I wanted to ask these two student submitted questions that we have specifically for this workshop. And the first, these are more general questions. And the first is, what do you think about school choice, or what are your feelings towards school choice?
Dr. Mallory, you want to take that first?
Oh, wow, that's a so I would say my short answer, just like other things, that's kind of a convoluted kind of question, right? School choice. I mean, I think what school choice has done is
it's huge. It's huge.
Yeah, it's huge. I feel like we can't deny that some individuals and some students who have been able to kind of gain access to school choice, and it has helped them in their situation, their circumstances, depending on where they're coming from, right? So I'll just put that and table that there. But by and large, I feel like it's a band-aid type of a solution to a systemic issue that continues to not be addressed, and I feel like, between school choice, I mean, we can get into kind of the charter school network and things that are happening, which is a whole nother conversation. I feel like until the root aspect of what is happening and has been happening in the educational system is addressed, by and large, and then we can lead to the equity, which I always say equity I kind of get frustrated with, because equity in itself, it needs to be a transference of resources, transference of so many things to, in fact, level the playing field someday. So I think kind of school choice, just to condense my thoughts, because I have so many thoughts and it's such a convoluted type question, is I think it's a band-aid solution that it has had some marginal benefits, but by and large, it's not the end all be all, and can never be the end all be all, because of all of these other, disparities that are so pervasive within the educational system. So I'm not the biggest fan, because it marginally has helped some and some students that I have known, but yeah, I think oftentimes people want like school choice. If the students could just change, I mean, could just choose and choose, and everything would just be equitable. And it's like, no, that's actually not the case. And then we take some of the students who do get bused to different school systems, and that type of, some school students here in Connecticut get bused from a Hartford, and then they go into a suburb here, or they do these things, and they have to wake up 2 hours earlier than their peers, and just, so all of those things get very kind of, it's very convoluted, and, but I don't think it's the I'm not the biggest fan, just because in an ideal world, if people could choose and the resources within it were bountiful and plentiful, yes, I would be over here on the sidelines cheering. It's just like, you get a school, you get a school, everybody gets the school that they want. But, you know, in fact, there's a lot of just challenges there. So that's my fear. I'd be interested to hear what Dr. G has to say on it.
Yeah,
But yeah, that's just my
yeah,
thoughts.
yeah. What you just said kind of resonated. It's kind of like you get a school and you get it's kind of, you get a choice, right? You get a
Right,
choice, and
right,
I think
right.
this kind of conversation around choice, we need to be asking who gets the choice, and then
Mhm.
does the groups that get the choice continue to kind of perpetuate the longstanding kind of, you know, inequities, right? You know, the extent to which choice continues to be, well, choice for those who have the privileges to have the choice. And is choice also based on kind of who your social networks are, right? Which we also know is influenced heavily by kind of your neighborhood and who you are surrounded with and who you grew up with. And so, you know, is choice again? I agree with you. You know, you'll talk to students, you'll talk to parents who say, yeah, this choice piece was great because it helped my student go to a school. You know, my student was being bullied at this one school. I
Mhm.
was able to choose this alternative charter school. There's also, as you know, some of the students in the audience may have attended charters that had like a specific focus on a specific kind of discipline area, or you know had a really, you know, strong focus on social justice, on equity itself. And I've seen, you know, good examples of that. But again, you know, we're not in this idealized world or this kind of perfect world where like the choices are equal and everyone has equal access to transportation to get to these different schools as well. One other thing is, you know, the idea of school choice was founded in part on this idea that if we kind of break the monopoly of public schools, right? You know, public schools are this massive monopoly that, you know, by introducing choice, that would introduce competition. Again, if we go back to this idea of school as a fundamental human right, I don't think people should be competing for these things in the way, you know, it should be the survival of the fittest. I'll say that. And it should be survival of the fittest to get a high quality education, but it is, and it continues to be. So how do we kind of lower those kind of, you know, barriers to entry, or how do we lower kind of this, you know, competitive nature of getting into the best schools? That you know, we haven't necessarily worked out. I don't think we'll work out necessarily in my lifetime those critical issues, but I think we can have a conversation about why that exists, survival of the fittest mentality exists, how we can again lower the barriers so that, you know, kids don't have to be, kids can say, I want to go to my local public school because it is high quality, not that I don't want to go and I need to seek these other choices. So it should be this conversation around what can we do to help support our public schools so they're just as high quality as, say, the charter school that's around the corner.
And if it helps you both, I too have complicated feelings about school choice
Yeah,
as well. And so I understand that when the question came out, you know, there's a hesitancy too as well. Because I just to even more context, I grew up in Southwest Philadelphia, impoverished neighborhood through and through, as you can name it, the food desert, you name it, it was there. It was my family's experience. And so there are times where I still have family who lived there. I would go back and visit during my high school, my undergraduate days as well. And schools that my neighborhood would fail. Like, they've been failing since I was a kid, but they will keep failing. And I would come back and there would be charter schools in the same location. Just a charter school pop up, another charter school pop up, and this is Philadelphia school system. And they keep they proliferate too when the system fails, and I guess and the state takes over in that regard to do its job. And so I think that, like you said, Dr. Mallory, it's a solution as well. I just also have trouble from a philosophical standpoint on introducing market reform for education, and that's where, because I don't think you know, we have to sit back and ask ourselves, what is the purpose of education? To your point, Dr. G, and what is the reality of it, and what is you know the value of choice bring to this, and how does it really affect my personal research questions that I still study about? But does it really make a more like a noticeable difference in education outcomes and achievement, as well, for those underserved students, or for just in general as well? I think that efficacy is something that's still being explored through research and literature. So it's definitely an interesting question, and interesting to see where it will develop to in the future as well. And for our second student submitted question, it's a more simple question about what made you want to work in your particular space or field. To whichever panelist want to go first.
Oh yeah, I'll just go. I think for me, you know, as an educator, I think we touched a little bit on it, just the dynamic of, I did not see myself I did not see myself ever reflected in the, within my curriculum or within my school. Part of the reason why I, turned down all of my corporate, to those who know me, and I won't get into that here for the essence of time, but part of the reason why I ultimately turned down corporate offers when certain things I started doing within my collegiate experience, and to say, you know what, I don't necessarily want to be a K through 12 teacher, but I know I want to impact the educational aspect. And I wasn't thinking about pedagogy and researching these things, but I knew that I wanted my story and the experiences of so many other students, right, to be seen, to be reflected, and to inspire them. And so that's what made me get into the field of education, into the culturally responsive and culturally sustained pedagogy fight that I'm having right now with educators. Is just like, if we want to be serious about the future of education and about the human fundamental right for these students to not only go to school and see themselves, but also, right, in the most optimal sense, right, you want your learning experience to, right, spark imagination and creativity. That's what I'm fighting for these students. So that's why I got into it. And the pedagogy and everything has informed the way that I think about these other micro, meso, macro forces, that how all of these things intertwine and a lot of the barriers that exist. But it was because I saw what was not there for me to then ultimately say, well, okay, I want to see that at the table, and I want to now, not only from a political perspective, not only from a policy perspective, and not only from the pedagogy perspective, I want to be able to understand these inner workings and then be able to say, but here's the data, and these are the resources needed for these students if we're serious about turning this ship around. And if we're not serious about turning the ship around, then this is lies the reality of how the systemic issues continue to stay.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'll share with you my route to education, which I'm still figuring out, even though I've been in this business for a while. Um, it kind of is grounded in this. Well, I'll just say that my mom was an educator. She was a classroom teacher, and she was one of the first Asian Am female classroom teachers in her district. So a lot of how I think about education was really influenced by her experience as an educator. But that also spilled into why I'm so passionate about what I do in education, and especially helping students who kind of sit on the sidelines, have sat on the sidelines traditionally. I did come from a very privileged background. I grew up in the suburbs and had a very solid education. Went to a UC school, did my undergraduate, and then went on to do graduate work as well. But in those times, I think I had these experiences of working with kids. I was an after-school program instructor leader working in Chinatown in San Francisco. I worked with first-gen women in an English language vocational education program as well. I think those experiences really shaped how I thought about myself as an educator, but also, what Dr. Mallory said, which is kind of great. Some folks want to do work as an educator, right? You can have your effect on what's happening in your classroom, but I thought, hey, maybe there's something I can do with my passion for education that allows me to kind of have this broader influence through my research, broader influence by engaging with policymakers, practitioners. And those are all the things that I feel like I can do, right? Because I can't solve all the problems, but I feel like I can work with individuals and at least engage them in thoughtful, deep conversations about these critical issues that we've been discussing today, so that they can go away and do their work and become, really thoughtful leaders, be it a teacher leader, be it a principal superintendent, be it up and coming leaders like yourself, Michael, to kind of reflect critically on what your role can be in addressing these ongoing, challenges in our education system.
Hmm. And that now sounds amazing. It's always interesting to see what inspires us to go down our career paths. I think, if I can add shortly, I think for me, it was my experience. I think my education experiences when I was in elementary school shaped a lot about how I felt. We're talking about school choice, and and my parents sent me to a school way out of my district where I used to live. So I was waking up at 10, 12, 6 or 8, I'm like 10, 11, 12 years old, going 4 miles by trolley, catching the school bus, and then going on outwards, just to get that quality education. And from then on, it shaped me from there as well. I think I just became critically reflective in my undergraduate experience. And just the thought that came to me is like, for our labor market in the United States, like what's the most fundamental document that you would need to enter it, like as like officially enter it. And that's your high school education or GED or equivalent as well. That's the first thing that they'll say, like, you need this to get a more than high paying job in the American labor force as well. And so I just always thought about how, what is education and what has it been, and, how has it been affecting, these underserved communities, and what ways can it change as well? Because I just think the personal thoughts. But I just think like the infrastructure there to educate as many people as we can to a quality level, that's from like literally physical infrastructure. The schools already exist, the districts already exist, like everything to reach as many kids as possible. But what's now been missing to kind of close that gap? And that's where I wanted to focus on in terms of policy equity and just being that future education decision maker, where I can just sit back and with my research experience and combine everything and just say that how can we move towards a positive future in education in the United States, and how can this, if we can create more scientific systems for it, beautiful. That means it can be replicated more around the country, because we know the the United States education system is more of a patchwork of 50 states and DC trying to work together and figure out what's best for their populations of students too at the same time. So that's really something that just kind of motivated me to be where I am today. And we have 7 minutes left. I will say, as we're wrapping up this panel, I do have one last question that we can just answer shortly as well. But as related to what my previous comments were, so Dr. Mallory, I'll start with you. How do you believe, to the best of your knowledge right now, we can best reimagine K through 12 or even post-secondary education as a system designed for equity moving forward?
Oh man, I wonder, I wish, I hope that you just, within take the political aspect side,
Hmm.
people really just understood and embraced just the human right that is associated with education.
Hmm.
I think at that fundamental level, when people understand it, right? And I think, it was mentioned, I think Dr. G mentioned it a little bit, right? This idea, oh, we can make things more competitive. But we're talking about 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds, right? So we're just talking about the human right that they deserve to have a fair and a high quality education. So for me, I think it's going to take a group collective of the Dr. G's, the Dr. Mallory's, the future Dr. Reeds, you know what I mean, as we continue to walk in purpose, and occupy leadership positions or networking into certain systems to be able to allow the research to inform how we can move the needle forward. But that's how I imagine, just if the more people could understand and embrace the idea of the human right, because we have the research, right? We have the frameworks. I'm sure Dr. G has so many frameworks he uses, and he can pull up curriculum, create curriculum. So we have those things, right? But it's how can we just, like I said, I just recently talked to some educators here in Connecticut, right? And I know it's not all, but other educators feel the same. It's, listen, to do all this extras, this is a privilege. This is not a right. Like, this is the way that, and if they are able to get their identity in other ways, then great, that's a bonus. But until we can just say, but no, this is a human right, I think that's how we can then not only reimagine education, but then those true outcomes that we're trying to have can then begin to manifest itself. Because unfortunately, and I think this is the thing that I worry about, where my sense of purpose and urgency comes, because technology has not made the same. Access to technology, as we've seen with COVID-19, has definitely not been equitable. But what kind of infuriates me is just this whole world of AI, artificial intelligence, and things that I don't quite understand, but I follow. And the more things get automated, but the more you have schools and across the country and rural parts of the world, don't have these access and resources. It's not just about having a high school diploma, that would be the issue, or dropping out. It's, I went to a school that's so far behind, just to even imagine it, I will forever be completely locked out of, a US economy, and I think those are the things that I feel like we need to get this thing right. Will it happen in our lifetime? I don't know. But I feel like that's just kind of the thing to reimagine it. It has to start with is this a human right for all kids? And if people can just say, nope, it's not, right? Just the privileged, those who come from higher socioeconomic. Once that level of honesty and transparency can come, then we can pivot. But until that happens on such a, you know, a grand scale, you know, I feel like that has to happen, or not, we're just going to be every few years constantly doing our part, which is a novel on all of our parts, right? But that true systemic change is going to continue to perpetuate itself. So that's my kind of concluding thoughts on that. I'll throw it to Dr. G, you know, for his thoughts.
Yeah. Thanks, Dr. Mallory. I agree with what you said. I think just to add on top of what you said, it's like Dr. Mallory, you nicely kind of mentioned how all these other kind of issues outside of the education kind of sphere influence what happens within our education system. So, you mentioned access to technology. That's huge, right? The kind of rural urban divide. So unless we kind of are able to also tackle simultaneously these larger, broader structural inequities that exist outside of the education system, I don't think we can get there, in terms of, trying to kind of tackle inequity within our school system, right? Because our school system functions with the broader inequitable system we have set up here. And so we can't have conversations around what it means to be equitable in education if we're not having those same conversations side by side with inequities in our healthcare system, inequities in our housing system, inequities with our access to transportation and to jobs, because all of that affects our schooling system. And again, I know this is a tall order, perhaps this is just carved out our slice to say we're gonna claim the education space, but we as educators in the field of education, as experts in the discipline of education, and I just want to remind our audience that education is a discipline in the social science. We need to be thinking interdisciplinarily, right, with our colleagues in sociology and economists, but even the hard sciences and whatnot, because these issues in education are not going to be solved alone, right? And plus, it's not going to be solved alone on the backs of folks of color like us. And that's another thing, right? Oftentimes solutions to kind of help vulnerable youth and kids of color fall on the shoulders of faculty of color. And it can't work that way anymore, right? It needs to also engage, folks in more dominant communities to say, here's the role that you can play in helping. This idea that education might be fundamental human right. Well, if it's a human right, here's what we need to do to provide high quality basic education to everyone.
Yes, thank you. And thank you both for not only both of those wonderful answers, but just a wonderful discussion that we've had so far. We have 1 minute left, so I do want to give, to our audience, if you can, virtually, we'll feel the spirit, give that round of applause for Dr. Mallory and Dr. G. This was a great panel, great discussion, a critical conversation during UConn's Human Rights Symposium on the first day for the Racial Equity and Black Lives Matter Committee as well. So thank you both again for your time, your efforts, and your participation in this panel.
Of course. Thanks so much, Michael. Mason, I appreciate your time in organizing us. And if students have questions, whatever, feel free to reach out to me. Happy to email. You can pass along my email.
Definitely will. Thank you.
Absolutely. Same here. It was a pleasure to be here. Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone for joining us. Hope you look forward to the next event.
Thanks.